In the depths of a Montana storm, two 6-year-old twins will knock on a stranger's door and change everything. What happens next will shatter a hardened mountain man's world and force him to confront a past he spent decades trying to forget. A dying mother's final words, a mysterious tattoo, and a legacy worth killing for. This is a story of redemption that will leave you breathless. Stay with me until the very end, and please comment below with your city so I can see how far this incredible story travels around the world. The wind howled like a banshee across the Montana peaks, driving sheets of rain against the weathered log cabin that had been Boaz McCrae's sanctuary for the better part of 20 years. At 67, his hands bore the calluses of a man who'd learned to survive on his own terms, chopping wood hunting game and keeping the world at arm's length. The crow tattoo on his left forearm had faded with time, but the memories it represented remained as sharp as the day the needle first pierced his skin. Boaz sat hunched over his simple wooden table, the flickering light of a kerosene lamp casting dancing shadows across the sparse interior of his one-room cabin. A tin cup of black coffee had grown cold beside his weathered hands as he stared into the flames of his wood-burning stove, lost in thoughts he'd rather forget. The storm outside matched the tempest that had raged within his soul for decades. A storm of guilt, regret, and self-imposed exile from a world he felt he no longer deserved to be part of. The isolation had become his penance. No telephone lines reached this far into the wilderness. No roads led to his door except for the narrow dirt path he'd carved himself through the dense pine forest. He'd chosen this place precisely because it was where civilization ended and the wild began. Here, among the towering peaks and endless sky, he could disappear from the mistakes of his past and the ghosts that haunted his dreams. But on this particular night, as lightning split the sky and thunder rolled across the mountains like the voice of an angry god, Boaz McCrae's carefully constructed solitude was about to be shattered by 3 soft knocks on his cabin door. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was so gentle, so tentative, that for a moment Boaz wondered if he'd imagined it. The wind was fierce enough to rattle the entire cabin, and tree branches scraped against his roof with an irregular rhythm that could easily be mistaken for something else. He remained still, his weathered face turned toward the door, listening intently. Knock, knock, knock. There it was again. Deliberate, unmistakable, and impossibly fragile against the fury of the storm. Boaz's heart began to pound as he slowly rose from his chair, the ancient floorboards creaking beneath his weight. In 20 years of living in this remote corner of the world, he could count on one hand the number of times anyone had found their way to his door, and never in a storm like this. Never at night, never with such a gentle, almost hesitant touch. He approached the heavy wooden door with the caution of a man who'd learned that unexpected visitors usually brought unexpected trouble. His right hand instinctively moved to the hunting knife at his belt as he paused just inches from the door, listening to the storm rage outside and wondering who or what could possibly be out there. "Who's there?" He called out, his voice rough from years of disuse in conversation. The words felt strange on his tongue, rusty and unfamiliar. For a moment there was only the sound of wind and rain. Then, barely audible above the storm, came a voice so small and fragile it made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't immediately name. "Please, mister, we need help." Boaz's blood turned to ice. That was a child's voice, no 2 voices speaking almost in unison. Children, out here, in this storm. His mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Lost hikers with children. An accident on the mountain, but the nearest road was 15 miles away, and the path to his cabin was treacherous, even in good weather. "Please," came the voice again, trembling now, with cold and fear. "Our mama told us to find you." Without hesitation, Boaz threw back the heavy wooden bolt and yanked open the door. The wind immediately tried to tear it from his hands as rain lashed into the cabin, but none of that mattered because standing on his threshold, illuminated by the lamplight spilling out into the darkness, were two of the most heartbreaking sights he'd ever seen. Two little girls, identical twins, who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, stood huddled together in the driving rain. They were soaked to the bone, their thin cotton dresses clinging to their small frames, their dark skin glistening with rainwater in the lamplight. They held hands with the desperate grip of children who had learned too young that they only had each other in the world. But it was their eyes that struck him like a physical blow, wide, dark, and filled with a mixture of terror and hope that made his knees nearly buckle. They looked up at him with the kind of trust that only children could possess, even when faced with a large, bearded stranger who probably looked more like a mountain devil than a savior. "Are you the man with the crow?" the girl on the left asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her lips were blue with cold, and she was shivering so violently that her words came out in stutters. Boaz's world tilted. His left hand unconsciously moved to cover the faded tattoo on his forearm as he stared down at the two small faces looking up at him with such desperate hope. The crow tattoo. How could they possibly know about that? And more importantly, who had told them to look for it? "Our mama said," the second girl continued, her voice matching her sister's whispered tone, "find the man with the crow tattoo. She said he would help us. She said he was good people, even if he don't think so himself." The words hit Boaz like a sledgehammer to the chest. There was only one person in the world who knew the full story behind his tattoo, only one person who might have told these children to seek him out. But that was impossible. Ruth Ellis had been dead to him for 20 years, existing only in his memories, and the guilt that ate at him like acid. "Ruth," he whispered, the name escaping his lips before he could stop it. The twins' faces immediately lit up with recognition and relief. "You know our mama," the first girl exclaimed, stepping forward eagerly. "She said you would know her. She said you were the only one who could keep us safe." Boaz felt his legs give out. He dropped to his knees in the doorway, bringing himself to eye level with the two children, rain soaking through his shirt as he stared into their faces. Now that he looked closely, he could see it. Ruth's eyes, Ruth's stubborn chin, Ruth's way of holding her head when she was determined about something. These weren't just any children seeking shelter from the storm. These were Ruth's daughters. "Where is she?" he managed to ask, though part of him already knew the answer from the past tense way they spoke about their mother. The girls exchanged a look that was far too adult for their years, a look that spoke of recent trauma and loss. The second twin, who seemed slightly older by perhaps minutes, took a shaky breath before answering. "Mama died 3 days ago," she said with the matter-of-fact tone that children use when they haven't yet fully processed the magnitude of their loss. "The fever took her. Before she went to heaven, she gave us this and told us to walk until we found the cabin with the crow man." She reached into the pocket of her soaked dress and pulled out a piece of paper now soggy and barely legible. But Boaz could make out his name written in Ruth's familiar handwriting along with rough directions to his cabin. The sight of her writing, even in this condition, sent a wave of emotion through him, so powerful he thought he might be sick. "She said you owed her," the first twin added quietly. "She said you'd understand." Boaz did understand. Oh, God help him, he understood completely. Ruth Ellis had been 22 years old the last time he'd seen her, beautiful and fierce and full of dreams about the future. He'd been a different man then, younger, stupider, and convinced that his own desires mattered more than doing the right thing. The crow tattoo had been a symbol of their connection, matching tattoos they'd gotten together in a moment of youthful passion that seemed like a lifetime ago. But he'd chosen his own path over her love, chosen the promise of easy money and adventure over building a life with the only woman who'd ever truly known his heart. When he'd left, Ruth had been pregnant. He'd known it, and he'd left anyway, telling himself she was better off without him. He'd spent the next 20 years trying to convince himself that he'd made the right choice. Looking at these two beautiful children, his children, he realized with a certainty that went beyond logic. He knew that every day of those 20 years had been built on a lie. "What are your names?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion he could no longer contain. "I'm Addie," said the first twin, the one who seemed slightly more outgoing. "And this is my sister Ada. We're twins, but I'm older by 4 minutes. Mama always said I came out first because I was more impatient." "Mama said we were miracles," Ada added softly, her voice carrying a wisdom that seemed impossible for someone so young. "She said we were born early, but God wasn't done with us yet, so He made us strong." Boaz felt tears streaming down his face, mixing with the rain that continued to pelt them all. These weren't just Ruth's children, they were his children. He could see himself in the stubborn set of Addie's jaw, in the way Ada observed everything with careful, intelligent eyes before speaking. The timeline fit perfectly. Ruth had given birth to twins who looked to be about 6 years old, and it had been just over 6.5 years since their last night together. "Come inside," he said, his voice breaking. "Both of you come inside right now before you catch your death." He ushered them into the cabin, immediately setting about getting them warm and dry. His hands shook as he stoked the fire higher and grabbed every blanket he owned, wrapping the girls in layer after layer of rough wool. They submitted to his ministrations with the patience of children who had learned to accept help from adults without question, but their eyes never left his face, as if they were memorizing every detail. "Are you really the Crow Man?" Addie asked as Boaz knelt before the fire, pulling off their soaked shoes and revealing tiny feet that were blue with cold. "I suppose I am," he replied, rolling up his sleeve to show them the faded tattoo. "Your mama and I got these a long time ago, before you were born." Both girls leaned forward to examine the tattoo with the intense curiosity of children. The crow was perched on a branch, its wings spread as if about to take flight. Time had faded the black ink to a grayish blue, and the fine details were no longer as sharp as they once were, but the image was still clearly recognizable. "Mama had one too," Ada said quietly. "On her shoulder. She used to let us trace it with our fingers when we couldn't sleep." Boaz closed his eyes as another wave of grief crashed over him. Ruth had kept the tattoo all these years, even after he'd abandoned her. She'd raised their children alone, and somehow she'd taught them to think of him as someone they could trust, someone who would help them when they had nowhere else to turn. "Tell me about your mama," he said, settling into his chair, as the girls huddled together on his simple bed, wrapped in every blanket he owned. "Tell me everything." For the next hour, as the storm continued to rage outside, Addie and Ada painted a picture of their mother that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Ruth had worked as a seamstress in the small town of Wetstone Hollow, taking in alterations and mending to make ends meet. She'd lived in a tiny apartment above the general store, and every Sunday she'd taken the girls to the small Baptist church, where she sang in the choir. "Mama had the prettiest voice," Addie said, her eyelids growing heavy as the warmth of the cabin finally began to chase away the chill. Everyone said so. When she sang Amazing Grace, even the men would cry. "She used to sing to us every night," Ada added unconsciously, moving closer to her sister for comfort. "She said singing was like praying, only prettier." Boaz learned that Ruth had never married, despite several men in town showing interest over the years. She'd told the girls that their father was a good man who'd gotten lost somewhere along the way, but that someday, if they ever really needed him, he would find them. "She said you had a good heart, but a troubled spirit," Ada explained with the serious tone children use when repeating something important an adult has told them. "She said sometimes good people do bad things when they're scared, but that don't make them bad people." The words cut through Boaz like a knife. Even after all these years, after he'd abandoned her when she needed him most, Ruth had spoken of him with kindness and understanding. She'd raised their children to believe their father was worth finding, worth trusting. The weight of that generosity, that grace he didn't deserve, nearly crushed him. "What happened when she got sick?" he asked gently, though he dreaded the answer. The girls exchanged another one of those looks that spoke of shared trauma. Addie took the lead, her voice becoming smaller as she recounted the events of the past week. "It started with a cough," she said. "Mama thought it was just a cold, but it got worse real fast. Mrs. Patterson from downstairs tried to help, brought soup and medicine from the doctor, but nothing worked. Mama kept getting hotter and hotter, and she couldn't hardly breathe." "The doctor came twice," Ada added, her voice barely above a whisper, "but he said there wasn't nothing more he could do, said it was in God's hands now." Boaz clenched his fists, imagining Ruth struggling for breath while he sat safe and comfortable in his mountain cabin, completely unaware that the woman he'd loved and abandoned was dying less than 100 miles away. "On the last night," Addie continued, tears beginning to track down her cheeks, "Mama called us over to her bed. She could barely talk, but she made us promise to remember what she told us about the Crow Man. She wrote down your name and how to find you, and she made us swear we'd come here if anything happened to her. She said you'd take care of us," Ada added, looking directly into Boaz's eyes with a trust that made his heart ache. "She said family takes care of family, even when they've been apart for a long time." The word family hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning 20 years of separation and regret. Boaz looked at these two beautiful, brave little girls who had walked through a mountain storm to find a father they'd never met, guided only by their dying mother's faith in a man who had failed her when it mattered most. Did she suffer much at the end?" he asked, barely able to get the words out. Both girls shook their heads immediately. "No, sir," Addie said firmly. "Mrs. Patterson said Mama looked peaceful when she went to sleep, said she had a little smile on her face like she was seeing something beautiful. The preacher said she went to heaven to sing with the angels," Ada added. "He said that's why God gave her such a pretty voice, so she'd be ready for the choir up there." Boaz had to turn away to hide the tears that were flowing freely now. The image of Ruth dying with a smile on her face, confident that her children would be safe because she'd sent them to him, was almost more than he could bear. She'd died trusting him to do the right thing, even though he'd proven 20 years ago that he was capable of making the worst possible choices when it mattered most. "Where did you sleep last night?" he asked, dreading the answer. "Under the bridge by Miller's Creek," Addie admitted reluctantly. "We had some bread and cheese that Mrs. Patterson gave us, and we found a place where it was mostly dry." "The night before that, we slept in the church," Ada added, "but Deacon Williams found us in the morning and said we couldn't stay there no more, said it wasn't proper for children to be alone in the Lord's house." Boaz felt anger flare in his chest at the thought of these two small children still grieving their mother's death, being turned away from the very place that should have offered them sanctuary. But the anger was quickly overwhelmed by a deeper emotion, a fierce protective instinct he'd never felt before. These were his daughters, his and Ruth's daughters, and they had been alone, scared and homeless while he sat in his cabin feeling sorry for himself. "You'll never sleep outside again," he said, the words coming out with more force than he'd intended. "Not as long as I'm breathing. This is your home now if you want it to be." Both girls looked at him with wide eyes, as if they couldn't quite believe what they were hearing. "You mean it?" Addie asked hesitantly. "You'll really let us stay?" "More than that," Boaz said, dropping to his knees in front of them and taking one small hand from each girl into his weathered palms. "I want you to stay. I need you to stay. I know I'm not much to look at, and I know this cabin isn't fancy, but if you'll have me, I'd like to try to be the father your mama always said I could be." The transformation in their faces was immediate and profound. The careful guardedness that had marked their expressions since arriving at his door melted away, replaced by a joy so pure and bright it took his breath away. Addie launched herself into his arms with the enthusiasm of a child who had been holding back tears for far too long. Yes, she exclaimed, wrapping her thin arms around his neck. Yes, we want to stay. We want to stay forever and ever. Ada was more reserved, but she climbed down from the bed and approached him slowly, studying his face with those intelligent eyes that reminded him so much of Ruth. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of someone far older than her 6 years. Mama said you'd been sad for a long time, she said quietly, reaching out to touch the crow tattoo on his arm. She said maybe we could help you remember how to be happy again. Boaz felt something break open in his chest. 20 years of self-imposed isolation and guilt cracking like an egg to let in the light. He wrapped both girls in his arms, holding them close as the storm continued to rage outside. For the first time in decades, his cabin felt like more than just a hiding place. It felt like a home. Your mama was right about a lot of things. He whispered into their hair, breathing in the scent of rain and childhood innocence. But I think she was wrong about one thing. What's that? Addie asked, pulling back to look at him with curious eyes. I think you two are going to help me do a lot more than just remember how to be happy, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I think you're going to help me remember how to be human again. As if summoned by his words, a tremendous crack of thunder shook the cabin, followed immediately by a flash of lightning so bright it turned the windows white for a split second. But for the first time in 20 years, Boaz McCrae wasn't afraid of the storm. He had something more important to focus on now. 2 small miracles who had walked out of the darkness to give him a second chance at the life he thought he'd lost forever. The girls fell asleep shortly after, exhausted by their ordeal and lulled by the warmth of the fire and the safety of being wanted. Boaz sat in his chair watching their peaceful faces in the firelight and tried to process the magnitude of what had just happened to his carefully ordered world. Ruth was gone. The thought hit him fresh, like a physical blow. The woman he'd loved and lost and spent 20 years regretting was dead, and he'd never have the chance to apologize for the choices he'd made. He'd never be able to tell her that not a day had passed when he didn't think about her, didn't wonder what their life together might have been like. But she'd given him something more precious than forgiveness. She'd given him their children. She'd raised Addie and Ada to believe in him, to seek him out when they had nowhere else to turn. Even in death, Ruth Ellis had found a way to offer him redemption. The storm outside was beginning to weaken, the thunder growing more distant, and the rain settling into a steady patter against the windows. Dawn was still hours away, but Boaz knew he wouldn't sleep. Too much had changed in the space of a few hours. The solitary existence he'd built for himself was over, and the uncertain future that lay ahead both terrified and exhilarated him. He was a father now. The thought was so foreign, so overwhelming, that he almost couldn't grasp it. Yesterday he'd been a lonely old hermit waiting to die, forgotten in the mountains. Tonight he was responsible for 2 precious lives. 2 little girls who were counting on him to provide not just shelter and food, but love and guidance and all the things a parent was supposed to give their children. The weight of that responsibility should have crushed him. Instead, for the first time in 20 years, Boaz McCrae felt like he had a reason to live. As he sat watching his daughters sleep, his daughters, the word still seemed impossible, he began to make plans. The cabin would need to be expanded. 2 growing girls couldn't live indefinitely in a single room. He'd need to build them proper beds, set up a space for them to play and learn. He'd have to figure out schooling, medical care, proper clothing for children. And then there was the matter of making their presence in his life legal and official. He had no idea what Ruth's will might have said, or if she'd even had one. There would be paperwork, legal procedures, probably a dozen bureaucratic hoops to jump through before he could officially claim his daughters. But first, there was something more immediate that needed his attention. As the storm finally began to clear and the first faint hints of dawn appeared on the horizon, Boaz made a decision that 20 years ago would have been unthinkable. Tomorrow, he was going to town. For the first time in 2 decades, Boaz McCrae was going to leave his mountain sanctuary and face the world he'd been hiding from. He was going to walk into Wetstone Hollow and claim his daughters properly, legally, and publicly. He was going to stand up and be counted as their father, regardless of what people might say about his past or his long absence from civilized society. The thought terrified him more than any mountain lion or grizzly bear ever had. But as he looked at Addie and Ada sleeping peacefully in his bed, their small hands still clasped together, even in sleep, he knew there was nothing in the world that would stop him from giving them the life they deserved. Ruth had trusted him with the most precious things in her world. He wouldn't fail her again. The crow on his arm seemed to pulse with new life as the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the windows. It was no longer just a faded reminder of his failures. It had become a symbol of the second chance he never thought he'd receive. Boaz McCrae, the mountain man who had spent 20 years running from his past, was finally ready to face his future. And that future had two names, Addie and Ada Ellis, the twin miracles who had knocked on his door and changed everything. The storm was over. The real journey was just beginning. The morning sun painted the mountain peaks in shades of gold and amber as Boaz prepared for the journey that would take him back into a world he'd sworn never to enter again. Addie and Ada sat at his simple wooden table, sharing a breakfast of flapjacks and wild honey, their eyes bright with curiosity about the adventure ahead. "Papa Boaz," Addie said, the title falling naturally from her lips, as if she'd been saying it her whole life. "Is the town really as big as Mama said it was?" Boaz paused in his packing, his heart still catching every time one of the girls called him Papa. The word carried a weight of responsibility and love that both terrified and strengthened him. "It's not too big," he replied, checking his saddlebags one more time, "but it's going to seem mighty different from up here on the mountain." Ada finished her last bite of flapjack and looked up at him with those serious eyes that reminded him so much of Ruth. "Will people be nice to us?" she asked quietly, and something in her tone suggested this wasn't an idle question. Boaz knelt down beside her chair, meeting her gaze directly. "Some will be, honey. Some might not be at first, but that's not your worry to carry. That's mine now." The truth was he had no idea what kind of reception awaited them in Whetstone Hollow. 20 years of self-imposed exile had left him completely disconnected from the rhythms and relationships of town life. He didn't know who was still alive, who had moved away, or what stories might have grown up around his disappearance. All he knew was that Ruth had lived there, raised their daughters there, and died there 3 days ago. The ride down the mountain took most of the morning, with Addie riding in front of him on his sturdy bay horse, while Ada sat securely behind her small arms, wrapped around his waist. They chattered constantly, pointing out wild flowers and asking endless questions about everything they saw. Their excitement was infectious, gradually easing the knot of anxiety that had been growing in his chest since dawn. "Look, Papa Boaz," Addie exclaimed as they crested the final ridge. "There's the town, Whetstone Hollow, spread out in the valley below them, like something from a picture book." The main street ran straight through the center, lined with wooden storefronts and shaded by mature oak trees. A white church steeple rose above the other buildings, and Boaz could see gardens and clotheslines behind the neat rows of houses. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys, and even from this distance he could hear the sounds of daily life. Dogs barking, children playing the rhythmic sound of someone chopping wood. It looked peaceful, prosperous, and utterly foreign to a man who had spent 2 decades living by his own rules in the wilderness. "It's beautiful," Ada breathed, her voice full of wonder. "Mama always said it was the prettiest town in all of Montana." As they descended into the valley, Boaz became increasingly aware of the attention they were drawing. People stopped their morning activities to stare at the bearded mountain man riding into town with 2 small children. Conversations halted mid-sentence, and he could feel eyes following their progress down the main street. "Where should we go first, Papa Boaz?" Addie asked, seemingly oblivious to the stares they were receiving. Before Boaz could answer, a woman emerged from the general store, her face lighting up with recognition and relief when she saw the twins. She was middle-aged with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun and flour dusting her apron. "Addie, Ada," she called out, hurrying toward them. "Oh, thank the Lord you're safe. We've been worried sick about you girls." This had to be Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who had helped Ruth during her final illness. Boaz dismounted and helped the girls down, watching as the woman enveloped them in a fierce hug. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Papa Boaz," Addie announced proudly. "He's the crow man Mama told us about." Mrs. Patterson's eyes widened as she looked up at Boaz, taking in his weathered face, his long hair, and the unmistakable resemblance between him and the two girls. "Well, I'll be," she murmured. "Ruth always said you'd come back someday. She just knew it in her heart." "I should have come sooner," Boaz said quietly, the words carrying 20 years of regret. "Don't you go carrying that burden," Mrs. Patterson replied firmly. "Ruth Ellis never spoke a word of blame about you, not once in all the years I knew her. Said you'd find your way back when the time was right, and looks like she was correct about that too." She wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron and gestured toward the general store. "Come inside, all of you. We've got some talking to do, and those girls need proper clothes if they're going to be staying with you." The general store was exactly what Boaz had expected. Shelves lined with everything from dry goods to farm tools, with bolts of fabric stacked neatly in one corner and penny candy displayed in glass jars near the counter. The proprietor, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up from his ledger book with obvious curiosity. "Henry Caldwell," Mrs. Patterson said by way of introduction. "This is Boaz McCrae, the girl's father." Henry's eyebrows shot up toward his receding hairline. "Their father? Well, I'll be damned. Excuse the language, girls. Ruth never said, that is, we all assumed." "She had her reasons for keeping it quiet," Boaz said simply, not wanting to discuss the complicated history in front of Addie and Ada. Of course," Henry stammered, clearly trying to process this unexpected development. "Well, welcome to Wetstone Hollow, Mr. McCrae. Terrible business about Ruth, just terrible. She was a fine woman, sang like an angel." Mrs. Patterson had already begun pulling dresses and undergarments from the shelves, holding them up against the girls to check for size. "These children need everything," she muttered more to herself than to anyone else. "Shoes, stockings, hair, ribbons, winter coats. I can pay," Boaz said quickly, reaching for the leather pouch where he kept his modest savings. "Course you can," Mrs. Patterson replied briskly, "but that's not the point. The point is getting these babies properly outfitted so they can hold their heads up proud in this town." As she continued her selections, other townspeople began to gather outside the store, their curiosity overcoming their manners. Boaz could see faces pressed against the windows and hear the low murmur of conversation as word spread about the mountain man who had come to claim Ruth Ellis's children. "Papa Boaz," Ada tugged at his sleeve, her voice dropping to a whisper, "why are all those people staring at us?" Before he could answer, the store door opened and a new figure entered. A tall, elderly black man with silver hair and the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command. He wore a simple brown suit, but there was something in his posture that spoke of military service and hard-won respect. "Sergeant Mathers," Mrs. Patterson said with obvious relief. "Thank goodness you're here." The man nodded politely to her before turning his attention to Boaz. "I'm Joshua Mathers," he said, extending his hand. "I served with the Buffalo Soldiers before settling here. Ruth Ellis was a good friend to my family." Boaz shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and the direct gaze that sized him up without judgment. "Boaz McCrae." "I know who you are," Sergeant Mathers replied calmly. "Ruth talked about you sometimes, especially toward the end. She said if anything happened to her, these girls would find their way to you." She had more faith in me than I deserved, Boaz admitted. Maybe so, Mathers said. But faith isn't about what we deserve. It's about what we do with the chances we're given. Before Boaz could respond, the store door burst open again, this time admitting a heavy-set man in an expensive suit whose presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. Several of the townspeople who had been gathering outside followed him in, and Boaz could sense the tension that seemed to radiate from this newcomer. "Well, well," the man said, his voice carrying an oily smoothness that immediately put Boaz on edge. "If it isn't the mysterious mountain hermit come down from his cave at last." Mrs. Patterson's face hardened. "Mr. Hall, this is a private conversation." "Oh, I don't think so, Mrs. Patterson," Hall replied, his small eyes fixed on Boaz. "When someone appears out of nowhere claiming to be the father of recently orphaned children, that becomes a matter of public interest." "I'm Merritt Hall," he continued, addressing Boaz directly. "I represent certain business interests in this region, and I have to say your timing is rather convenient." "What's that supposed to mean?" Boaz asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Hall smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Only that Ruth Ellis died owing considerable debts, and her property has already been sold to cover them. These children, if they truly are your responsibility, are going to need somewhere to live." "What property?" Sergeant Mathers demanded, stepping forward. "Ruth owned her apartment outright, and she had that land her grandfather left her." "That being the operative phrase," Hall replied smugly. "I'm afraid she took out a loan against both properties last year to pay for medical expenses. When she couldn't make the payments—" He shrugged eloquently. Boaz felt his hands clench into fists. "You're lying." "I have the paperwork right here," Hall said, pulling a sheaf of documents from his coat pocket. "All properly notarized and filed with the county clerk. The land is scheduled to be developed into a rail stop within the month." The silence that followed was deafening. Boaz could see the shock and confusion on the faces of the townspeople and the growing worry in Mrs. Patterson's eyes. But it was the small hand that slipped into his that steadied him, Ada looking up at him with those trusting eyes that said she believed he would fix whatever was wrong. "May I see those papers?" a new voice asked from the doorway. Everyone turned to see a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and intelligent eyes wearing a simple but well-made dress. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Martha Tooley." She introduced herself to Boaz with a nod. "I'm the town healer, and I was with Ruth when she passed." Hall's confidence seemed to waver slightly. "Mrs. Tooley, this is really a matter for the courts." "Then you won't mind if I examine these supposed documents?" Martha replied coolly, holding out her hand. Reluctantly, Hall handed over the papers. Martha studied them carefully, her expression growing increasingly grim. "These signatures don't look right," she said finally. "Ruth Ellis had beautiful handwriting. I've seen it many times. This looks like someone tried to copy it." "Now see here," Hall began, but Martha cut him off. "Furthermore," she continued, "Ruth was lucid and alert until the very end. On her final night, she gave me something to hold for her daughters." She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn leather Bible. She said if anything happened to her, I was to make sure this got to the man with the crow tattoo. Hall's face had gone pale. "A Bible proves nothing." "It does when it contains the original deed to her grandfather's land," Martha replied, opening the book to reveal papers tucked carefully between its pages. "Along with his will, which specifically states that the land can never be sold outside the family line." The impact of her words rippled through the gathered crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Hall's carefully constructed facade began to crumble as people started to murmur among themselves, their voices carrying a new note of suspicion and anger. "This is impossible," Hall sputtered. "I have legal documents. You have forgeries," Sergeant Mathers stated flatly, "and not very good ones by the sound of it." Boaz took the Bible from Martha's hands, feeling its weight and the warmth of Ruth's touch that still seemed to linger on its worn leather cover. As he opened it to the hidden papers, a letter fell out, addressed in Ruth's familiar handwriting, to Boaz, the father of my heart's greatest treasures. His hands shook as he unfolded it, aware that the entire store had fallen silent, waiting. Ruth's words, written in her final days, seemed to reach across the veil of death, to speak directly to his heart. My dearest Boaz, he read silently, if you are reading this, then my girls have found you, and I am at peace. I never blamed you for leaving. We were both young and scared, and you thought you were doing what was best. But these beautiful daughters we made together are proof that even our mistakes can become God's greatest blessings. The land is theirs by right, and now it's yours to protect. Don't let them take what belongs to our children. Be the man I always knew you could be. All my love, Ruth. Well, Hall demanded, his voice shrill with growing desperation. What does it say? Boaz looked up from the letter, his eyes finding Hall's face. It says that my daughters own the land you're trying to steal, and it says that anyone who tries to take it from them is going to have to go through me first. The threat in his voice was unmistakable, and Hall took an involuntary step backward. The mountain man who stood before him looked nothing like the broken hermit he'd been expecting. This was a father protecting his children, and there was something in his eyes that suggested he'd faced down far more dangerous adversaries than a small-town land grabber. Now see here, Hall tried again, but his bluster had lost its power. I have investors' contracts, you have forgeries and theft, Martha Tooley interrupted, and if you're wise, you'll leave this town before we decide to involve the territorial marshal. This isn't over, Hall said, backing toward the door. There are legal processes, courts of law. Yes, there are, came a new voice from outside, and I represent them. The crowd parted to admit a man in his 40s, wearing a black coat and the unmistakable bearing of authority. A silver star gleamed on his chest, and his hand rested casually on the butt of his pistol. Deputy Marshal William Torres, he introduced himself. I've been investigating reports of fraudulent land deals in this region. His eyes fixed on Hall with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey. Imagine my surprise to ride into town and hear raised voices discussing forged documents and stolen property. Hall's face went from pale to ashen. Marshal, I can explain. I'm sure you can, Torres replied dryly. In fact, I'm looking forward to hearing your explanation in great detail. But first, I think we need to examine those documents you've been waving around. As the marshal took charge of the situation, Boaz felt a hand on his arm. He looked down to see Reverend Josiah Bell, a kindly man with white hair and eyes full of compassion. Mr. McCrae, the Reverend said quietly, I officiated at Ruth's funeral 3 days ago. She was a pillar of our church community, and these children are precious to all of us. If there's anything our congregation can do to help. Thank you, Reverend, Boaz replied, his voice still rough with emotion from reading Ruth's letter. I think we're going to need all the help we can get. Outside, they could hear the marshal reading Hall his rights and the sound of handcuffs clicking into place. The attempted land grab was over before it had really begun, but Boaz suspected this was only the beginning of their troubles. Papa, Boaz, Addie whispered, tugging at his shirt. What's happening? Are we in trouble? He knelt down to her level, gathering both girls close. No, honey, you're not in trouble. Some bad men were trying to take something that belongs to you, but the good people here stopped them. Like Mama's land? Ada asked, with that uncanny perception she seemed to possess. Exactly like Mama's land, Boaz confirmed. Your great-great-grandfather left it to your family, and nobody has the right to take it away from you. Mrs. Patterson had resumed her selections of clothing, her movements brisk and efficient. Well, she said, as if criminal conspiracies were just another part of her daily routine. That's settled then. Now, girls, let's get you properly dressed so you can meet the rest of the town without looking like little waifs. As the immediate crisis passed, more townspeople began to enter the store, their curiosity overcoming their caution. Boaz found himself the center of attention in a way that made his skin crawl, but he forced himself to remain calm for the sake of his daughters. "So you're really their father?" asked a woman with graying hair and kind eyes. Ruth never said. She had her reasons. Boaz replied, the phrase becoming his standard response to that particular question. "Well, those girls are treasures," said another woman. "Smart as whips, both of them, and sweet as honey. Ruth did a fine job raising them." "She did," Boaz agreed, his throat tight with emotion. A farmer in overalls stepped forward, hat in hand. "Name's Pete Garrison. I knew your girl's mama sang with her in the church choir. Just wanted to say if you need any help getting settled, building anything, my boys and I would be happy to lend a hand." Similar offers came from all directions, help with construction, offers of meals, promises of friendship and support, that overwhelmed Boaz with their generosity. These people had loved Ruth, and they were prepared to extend that love to her children and the man who had come to claim them. But not everyone was so welcoming. Boaz noticed several men standing apart from the friendly crowd, their faces hard and unwelcoming. He recognized the type. Men who saw his long absence and sudden appearance as suspicious, who wondered what kind of father abandoned his children and only came back when it was convenient. One of them, a burly man with tobacco-stained teeth, finally spoke up. "Seems mighty convenient you showing up right after Ruth dies. How do we know you're really their father? How do we know you're not just some drifter looking to take advantage?" The friendly chatter died away as everyone turned to hear Boaz's response. He could feel Addie and Ada pressing closer to him, sensing the hostility in the man's voice. "You don't know," Boaz said quietly. "You'll just have to decide for yourself whether to believe it or not." "That's not good enough," the man pressed. "We've got responsibilities to these children. Can't just hand them over to any stranger who shows up with a tall tale." "Buck Henley," Mrs. Patterson said sharply, "you mind your own business." These girls knew exactly who they were looking for, and they found him. "Could be he put them up to it," Henley persisted. "Could be he's been watching the town waiting for his chance." The accusation hung in the air like smoke poisoning the atmosphere that had been growing increasingly warm and welcoming. Boaz felt his temper rising, but before he could respond, a small voice piped up from beside him. "That's not true," Addie declared, her young voice ringing with indignation. "Papa Boaz didn't even know Mama was sick. He cried when we told him she went to heaven. And he has the same eyes as us," Ada added quietly but firmly. "And Mama said he would have the crow tattoo, and he does." The simple honesty in their voices seemed to affect even the skeptical townspeople. Henley's bluster deflated somewhat, though his expression remained suspicious. Deputy Marshal Torres chose that moment to re-enter the store, his prisoner having been loaded into a wagon bound for the territorial jail. "Well," he announced, "that's one problem solved. Mr. Hall will be enjoying the hospitality of the territorial prison while we investigate his business dealings." He turned to Boaz with a more serious expression. "I'm going to need to take statements from all of you about this land situation. And Mr. McCrae, I'll need to verify your identity and your relationship to these children for the official record." "Of course," Boaz replied. "Whatever you need." "Good, but first let me say that in my experience, criminals like Hall don't work alone. If he was trying to steal your children's land, there's a good chance he has partners who won't be happy about his arrest." The warning sent a chill through the room. Boaz instinctively moved to place himself between his daughters and the door, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. "What are you saying, Marshal?" Sergeant Mathers asked. "I'm saying this family needs to be careful for a while. Men who deal in stolen land don't usually give up just because one of their own gets arrested. They've got money and vested expectations to meet." Mrs. Patterson straightened to her full height, her jaw set with determination. "Well, then it's a good thing this town knows how to take care of its own." A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd, and Boaz felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. the warmth of community support, the knowledge that he and his daughters weren't facing their challenges alone. Reverend Bell stepped forward. "Marshal, if you think there might be trouble, perhaps we should arrange for some of the men to keep watch. And Mr. McCrae, you and the girls are welcome to stay at the parsonage until we're sure it's safe." "Thank you, Reverend, but I think we'll be safer at the cabin," Boaz replied. "It's easier to defend, and I know the mountain better than any strangers who might come looking for trouble." "Wise thinking," Torres agreed, "but I'd suggest you don't travel alone for a while and keep those legal documents somewhere safe. They're the only proof of your daughter's rightful ownership of that land." As the afternoon wore on, the crisis atmosphere gradually gave way to more normal activities. Mrs. Patterson finished outfitting the girls with new clothes, several church ladies arrived with baskets of food, and plans were made for a proper welcome dinner at the church the following Sunday. But through it all, Boaz remained alert, watching the faces around him, noting who seemed genuinely welcoming and who still harbored suspicions. He'd learned long ago that danger rarely announced itself with dramatic gestures. It usually came quietly, wearing a friendly face, until the moment it struck. "Papa Boaz," Ada said, as they prepared to leave the store, "when can we see Mama's land?" The question caught him off guard. In all the excitement of the day, he'd almost forgotten that his daughters now owned property. The land their mother had fought to protect, the land that Ruth's grandfather had left to his descendants. "Soon, honey," he promised. "We'll ride out there tomorrow and take a look." "Will you build us a house there?" Addie asked excitedly. "With a real parlor and everything, if that's what you want," Boaz replied, though the thought of leaving his mountain sanctuary permanently filled him with unease. "I want a garden," Ada said dreamily, "like Mama always talked about, with flowers and vegetables and maybe some fruit trees." As they loaded their purchases into his saddlebags and prepared for the ride back up the mountain, Boaz found himself looking at Wetstone Hollow with new eyes. This wasn't just a town anymore. It was his daughter's home, the place where they'd been born and raised, where their mother was buried, and their future lay waiting. The mountain had been his refuge for 20 years, but it was time to accept that his days of hiding were over. Addie and Ada needed more than just survival. They needed education, community, and the chance to grow up among people who had loved their mother. "Goodbye, Mrs. Patterson," the girls called out as they mounted the horse. "Thank you for everything." "You're welcome, my dears," she replied, wiping tears from her eyes. "You come back and visit me real soon, you hear?" As they rode out of town, Boaz caught sight of several men watching their departure from the shadows between buildings. Not everyone in Whetstone Hollow was friendly, and if the marshal was right about Hall having partners, their troubles were far from over. But for the first time in 20 years, Boaz McCrae wasn't facing the future alone. He had two precious reasons to be strong, to be brave, and to believe that tomorrow might be better than yesterday. The ride back up the mountain was quiet, both girls exhausted by the emotions and excitement of the day. As the cabin came into view, Boaz felt the familiar sense of homecoming that had sustained him through 2 decades of solitude. But now it meant something different. Now it wasn't just a hiding place, it was the first step in building a new life for his family. The real work was just beginning. 3 weeks had passed since their first trip to Whetstone Hollow, and the mountain cabin had transformed into something approaching a real home. Boaz had built proper beds for the girls, carved simple furniture from pine logs, and even fashioned a small table where they could sit and practice their letters. The evenings were filled with the sound of children's laughter, something that had never echoed off these walls before. But on this particular morning, as dawn painted the peaks in shades of rose and gold, an unsettling quiet had settled over their little sanctuary. Boaz noticed it first when he woke to silence instead of the usual chatter of his daughters preparing for the day. The absence of their voices sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Eddie, Ada," he called softly, not wanting to alarm them if they were simply sleeping late. Silence. Boaz threw off his blankets and crossed to their beds. In 3 quick strides, what he found made his blood turn to ice. The beds were empty, the quilts thrown back hastily, and there was no sign of the girls anywhere in the cabin. "Ada!" he shouted, his voice cracking with panic as he searched every corner of the small space. A piece of paper was pinned to Ada's pillow with something that made Boaz's heart stop completely. A railroad spike driven deep into the wood with deliberate force. His hands shook as he pulled the note free and read the crude lettering scrawled across it. "If you want to see the girls again, bring the land deed to Serpent Canyon by sunset. Come alone or they die." The paper crumpled in his fist as 20 years of mountain survival instincts kicked in. His daughters had been taken. Someone had entered his home while he slept and stolen the most precious things in his world. The protective rage that filled him was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. A cold, deadly fury that made his vision narrow to a single crystal-clear purpose. He had to find them. He had to bring them home. And God help anyone who stood in his way. Boaz grabbed his rifle, his hunting knife, and the leather pouch containing Ruth's Bible and the precious deed. As he saddled his horse with swift, practiced movements, his mind raced through possibilities. Serpent Canyon was a treacherous stretch of rocky gorges 15 miles south, a place where the terrain was so dangerous that even experienced mountaineers avoided it unless absolutely necessary. It was the perfect place for an ambush. The ride down the mountain had never seemed longer. Every minute that passed was another minute. His daughters were in the hands of men who had already proven they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. Boaz pushed his horse harder than he ever had before taking risks on narrow paths that would have been foolhardy under normal circumstances. As he reached the valley floor, he saw a familiar figure waiting by the bridge over Miller's Creek. Sergeant Mathers sat astride a sturdy black horse, his military bearing unmistakable even from a distance. "Mathers," Boaz called out as he approached. "What are you doing here?" "Waiting for you," the former Buffalo soldier replied calmly. "Martha Tooley had a dream last night. Said she saw trouble coming for those girls of yours. She sent me to find you." Boaz quickly explained about the kidnapping and the ransom demand. Mather's expression grew grimmer with each word, but his voice remained steady and controlled. "You're not going to Serpent Canyon alone," he stated. "That's exactly what they want. You isolated and vulnerable." "I can't risk the girls' lives," Boaz protested. "The note said, 'Come alone.'" "The note was written by men who think they're dealing with a broken-down hermit," Mathers replied. "They don't know they're facing a father who'll burn down half of Montana to get his children back." Before Boaz could argue further, 2 more riders appeared on the path leading from town. Reverend Bell and a young man Boaz didn't recognize approached at a gallop, their faces grim with purpose. "Mr. McCrae," the Reverend called out as they drew near. "Thank God we found you. The whole town's in an uproar. Someone saw strange men near your cabin before dawn." The young man with him looked to be in his early 20s, with the lean build and weathered skin of someone who spent his life outdoors. His dark hair was braided in the traditional style, and his eyes held an intensity that spoke of deep intelligence and fierce loyalty. "This is Jonah 2 Rivers," Reverend Bell explained. "He's been tracking the men who took your daughters." Jonah nodded respectfully to Boaz. "I found their trail about an hour after sunrise. 4 men riding hard toward the southern canyons. They have the children with them." "Are they—" Boaz couldn't finish the question, couldn't voice his deepest fear. "They're alive," Jonah said firmly. "I could see small footprints in the dirt where they stopped to water their horses. The girls are walking on their own." Relief flooded through Boaz, followed immediately by renewed determination. "How long of a head start do they have?" 3 hours, maybe 4, Jonah replied. "But they're moving slower because of the children. If we leave now, we can reach Serpent Canyon before sunset." Boaz looked at the 3 men who had come to his aid. "This isn't your fight. The hell it isn't, Mathers said bluntly. Those girls belong to this community now, and in this community we protect our own. Besides, Reverend Bell added with a gentle smile that didn't hide the steel beneath it. Ruth Ellis was one of my parishioners. I baptized those children when they were babies. I'm not about to let harm come to them now. Jonah simply nodded. My people have an old saying, the spirits of the mountains protect those who protect the innocent. Today, we are those spirits. The unlikely rescue party set out immediately, riding hard through terrain that grew increasingly treacherous as they approached the canyon lands. Jonah led the way, reading signs in the landscape that were invisible to the others. A broken twig here, a hoofprint in soft earth there, the subtle trail left by men who thought they were being clever. They're confident, he reported, as they paused to rest their horses near a natural spring. They're not trying very hard to hide their tracks. They think they have all the advantages. What do you know about Serpent Canyon? Boaz asked, studying the rocky formations that loomed ahead of them. It's a death trap if you don't know the way through, Mathers replied grimly. Narrow passages, loose rock places where one man with a rifle could hold off an army, but it also has only 2 ways, in or out. 3, actually, Jonah corrected quietly. There's an old deer path that comes down from the north face. It's dangerous, but it would put us above them. How dangerous? Reverend Bell asked. Jonah's expression was grave. Dangerous enough that we might not all make it. But it's the only way to get the element of surprise. As they discussed strategy, the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Time was running short, and every delay meant another hour that Addie and Ada were in the hands of their captors. I'm going in alone, Boaz decided. I'll meet their demands, trade the deed for the girls. Once they're safe, you can do whatever you want with the men. That's suicide, Mathers objected. They're not planning to honor any bargain. Men like this don't leave witnesses. Then what do you suggest? We split up. Jonah said, his tactical mind already working through the possibilities. Reverend Bell and I take the deer path, get into position above the canyon. Sergeant Mathers circles around to block the southern exit. Mr. McCrae goes in from the main entrance as planned. And then? Boaz asked. Then we improvise, Mathers replied with a grim smile. I've been improvising my way out of impossible situations for 30 years. Today won't be any different. As they prepared to separate, Reverend Bell placed a hand on Boaz's shoulder. We're going to get them back, he said with quiet conviction. Those girls have been through enough loss. God isn't going to let them lose another parent. The words were meant to be comforting, but they only reminded Boaz of everything he had to lose. Just weeks ago, he'd been a solitary hermit with nothing to live for. Now he had 2 daughters who called him Papa, who trusted him to keep them safe, who had already lost their mother and couldn't bear to lose him too. The main entrance to Serpent Canyon was exactly as treacherous as its reputation suggested. High walls of red stone rose on either side of a narrow passage barely wide enough for 2 horses to pass abreast. The path twisted and turned like a snake with blind corners that could hide any number of dangers. Boaz rode slowly, every sense alert for signs of ambush. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of his horse's hooves on stone and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. As he rounded one particularly sharp bend, the canyon opened into a wider area surrounded by towering walls of rock, and there in the center of the natural amphitheater, he saw them. Addie and Ada sat on a fallen log, their hands tied behind their backs, but otherwise unharmed. Relief flooded through him at the sight of them alive and apparently unhurt, followed immediately by cold fury at the men who had dared to terrorize his children. 4 men emerged from concealment among the rocks, their rifles trained on him with professional precision. The leader was a thin man with a scraggly beard and cruel eyes, wearing a deputy's badge that Boaz suspected was either stolen or fake. Well, the man drawled, The mountain hermit decided to show up after all, starting to think you didn't care much about these little ones. "I'm here," Boaz said simply, his voice deadly calm. "Let them go." "Papa Boaz," Addie called out, her voice cracking with relief and fear. "They said they were going to hurt us if you didn't come." "Nobody's going to hurt you, honey," Boaz replied, never taking his eyes off the armed men. "Papa's here now," the leader laughed to sound like grinding glass. "How touching, but you're not exactly in a position to make promises, are you, mountain man?" "What do you want?" Boaz asked, though he already knew the answer. "The deed to that land, of course. Hand it over and we might let you and the brats walk out of here." "Might?" The man's smile turned uglier. "Well, you've already caused us considerable trouble. Mr. Hall was a valued business partner, and his arrest has complicated our operations. Some compensation is in order." Boaz slowly reached into his saddlebag and withdrew the leather pouch containing Ruth's Bible and the precious deed. "The land belongs to my daughters. It's their inheritance from their mother." "Not anymore, it doesn't." Another of the men spoke up, this one with the look of an experienced gunfighter. "That land's sitting right on the route for the new railroad spur, worth a fortune to the right people." "Funny thing about fortunes," came a new voice from above them. "They don't mean much when you're dead." Everyone looked up to see Jonah Two Rivers standing on a narrow ledge 30 feet above the canyon floor, his rifle aimed down at the kidnappers. "I'd suggest you gentlemen reconsider your position." The leader snarled and swung his rifle toward the girls. "You make one move and these brats die first." "No," said Sergeant Mathers, emerging from behind a boulder with his own weapon drawn. "They don't." Suddenly the kidnappers found themselves caught in a crossfire with armed men above and behind them, but instead of surrendering, the leader's face twisted with rage and desperation. "If we can't have the land, nobody can," he screamed, and Boaz saw his finger tighten on the trigger. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Boaz threw himself from his horse, diving toward his daughters as gunfire erupted throughout the canyon. The sound was deafening, echoing off the stone walls like thunder. He hit the ground hard, rolling to cover Addie and Ada with his body as bullets whined overhead. "Stay down," he shouted to the girls, feeling them trembling beneath him. The gunfight lasted only moments, but it felt like an eternity. When the echoes finally died away, an eerie silence settled over the canyon. Boaz raised his head cautiously, keeping his body between his daughters and any remaining threats. 3 of the kidnappers lay motionless on the canyon floor. The 4th, the gunfighter who had spoken about the railroad fortune, sat propped against a rock wall with blood seeping through his shirt. He was still alive, but his weapon lay several feet away. "Is everyone all right?" Reverend Bell called out as he and Jonah made their way down from their elevated position. "The girls are safe," Boaz replied quickly, cutting the ropes that bound his daughter's hands. Both children threw themselves into his arms, sobbing with relief and terror. "Papa Boaz, we were so scared," Addie cried, clinging to him with desperate strength. "I know, honey, I know," he murmured, holding them both close. "But it's over now. You're safe." Sergeant Mathers approached the wounded gunfighter, his rifle still at the ready. "What's your name, friend?" The man looked up with pain-glazed eyes. "Jake Morrison. Used to ride with the Reynolds gang before they got themselves killed." "Who hired you to take the children?" Mathers demanded. Morrison coughed, blood speckling his lips. "Man named Branford. Runs a development company back east. Said the railroad was counting on that land, and they didn't care how they got it." "Where can we find this Branford?" Jonah asked. "Won't matter," Morrison replied weakly. "He's got dozens of men, more money than God, and friends in high places. You killed us, but there'll be others." The implications of his words hung heavy in the canyon air. This wasn't just about a single land grab or a small group of criminals. It was about powerful interests that saw Addie and Ada's inheritance as an obstacle to be removed by any means necessary. "What do we do now?" Reverend Bell asked quietly. Before anyone could answer, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon. Everyone tensed weapons ready until Deputy Marshal Torres appeared at the entrance with a small posse of federal marshals. "Looks like we missed the party," Torres observed, surveying the scene with professional calm. "How did you know to come here?" Boaz asked. "Martha Tooley," Torres replied with a slight smile. "That woman has an uncanny sense for trouble. She rode into town this morning saying there was going to be bloodshed in the canyons and that we'd better get out here fast." As the marshals took charge of the crime scene and the wounded prisoner, Torres pulled Boaz aside for a private conversation. "This Morrison fellow is small fish," he said quietly. "The people behind this land grab have resources we can barely imagine. They're going to keep coming until they get what they want." "What are you saying?" Boaz asked, though he suspected he already knew. "I'm saying your daughters are going to be in danger as long as they own that land. There's too much money at stake for men like Branford to just walk away." Boaz looked over at Addie and Ada, who were being comforted by Reverend Bell while Jonah and Mathers secured the area. His beautiful, brave daughters who had already endured so much loss and trauma. The thought of them living in constant fear, always looking over their shoulders, made his heart ache. "There might be another way," Torres continued. "If you were willing to sell the land to the territorial government, they could turn it into a protected preserve. No railroad, no development, just wilderness preserved for future generations." "How much?" "Enough to buy a good spread somewhere else, set up a proper home for those girls, maybe even send them to college when they're older." It was a tempting offer, but Boaz knew it wasn't his decision to make alone. "I'll have to talk to them about it. It's their inheritance, their choice." "Fair enough," Torres agreed, "but don't take too long to decide. Men like Branford don't give up easy, and next time we might not be so lucky." As the sun began to set behind the canyon walls, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, the rescue party prepared for the journey back to Wetstone Hollow. Morrison had been stabilized enough for transport, and the bodies of his companions were loaded onto pack horses. "Papa Boaz," Ada said quietly as they rode out of Serpent Canyon, "why did those men want to hurt us?" It was a question that cut to the heart of everything. The greed that drove men to threaten children, the injustice of powerful interests, trampling on the rights of the innocent, the harsh reality of a world where money often mattered more than human life. "Because they wanted something that belonged to you," he answered honestly. "And they thought scaring you would be the easiest way to get it. But why didn't they just ask?" Addie wondered with the innocent logic of childhood. "Mama always said if you need something, you should ask politely first." "Your mama was a wise woman," Reverend Bell interjected gently. "But not everyone learned the same lessons she did about right and wrong." As they crested the final ridge before Whetstone Hollow, they could see lights beginning to twinkle in the windows below. The sight of the peaceful town with its white church steeple and tree-lined streets was the most beautiful thing Boaz had seen in years. "Look," Sergeant Mathers pointed to the main street where a crowd was gathering despite the late hour. "Word travels fast in a small town." Indeed, it seemed like half the population of Whetstone Hollow had turned out to welcome them home. Mrs. Patterson stood at the front of the crowd, wringing her hands with worry until she saw the girls riding safely with their father. Martha Tooley was there too, her knowing eyes taking in every detail of their condition. "Thank the Lord," Mrs. Patterson cried as they dismounted. "When Martha said you'd all gone off to face danger, I thought my heart would stop." "We're fine, Mrs. Patterson," Addie assured her, accepting the woman's fierce hug. "Papa Boaz saved us, and so did Sergeant Mathers and Jonah and Reverend Bell. Heroes, all of them," Martha Tooley declared, though her eyes lingered on Boaz, with an expression that suggested she saw more than she was saying. "But this is just the beginning, isn't it?" Her question was directed at Deputy Marshal Torres, who had ridden into town behind them. His grave nod confirmed what they all suspected. The danger was far from over. "We need to talk," Torres said to the assembled crowd, "all of us, about what happened today and what it means for this town." The impromptu town meeting was held in the church, with oil lamps providing flickering light and casting long shadows on the walls. Torres stood at the front, his marshal's badge gleaming in the lamplight as he addressed the concerned faces before him. The men who took these children today were hired by a development company with railroad connections. He began without preamble. They want the Ellis land, and they're willing to kill for it. A murmur of outrage rippled through the crowd. These were decent people, hard-working folks who believed in law and order and the protection of the innocent. "What can we do?" asked Pete Garrison, the farmer who had offered to help Boaz when he first came to town. "First, we can make sure this family knows they're not alone," Torres replied. "United communities are harder to intimidate than isolated individuals." "And second," Sergeant Mathers prompted, "second, we can help them make a decision about that land. As long as they own it, they'll be targets. But there are options that might keep everyone safe while still honoring Ruth Ellis's wishes for her daughters." Boaz stood up, Addie and Ada flanking him on either side. "Before we make any decisions about the land, there's something I need to say to all of you." The church fell silent, every face turned toward him, expectantly. "3 weeks ago, I was a broken man living alone on a mountain, convinced I didn't deserve to be part of any community." He began, his voice steady, despite the emotion underlying his words. "These girls changed all that. They gave me a reason to live, a reason to hope, a reason to be better than I was." He paused, looking around at the faces that had become familiar, at the people who had welcomed his daughters and accepted him despite his past. "But today I learned something else," he continued. "I learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about people who stand with you when trouble comes, who risk their lives for your children, who open their hearts to strangers, because it's the right thing to do." His voice grew stronger as he spoke. "You could have turned your backs on us. You could have said it wasn't your problem that we brought the danger on ourselves. Instead, you rode into that canyon knowing you might not come back, all to save 2 little girls who aren't even your own." "But they are our own," Mrs. Patterson declared firmly. "Every child in this town is our own." "That's what I'm trying to say," Boaz replied. "You've shown me what community really means. You've given my daughters something I could never give them alone. A place to belong, people who care about them, a future worth fighting for." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the deed to Ruth's land, holding it up for everyone to see. "This land belongs to Addie and Ada by right of inheritance," he said. "But what we do with it should be a decision we make together as a family, as a community." Deputy Marshal Torres stepped forward. "The territorial government is prepared to make a fair offer for the land. It would be preserved as a wilderness area protected from development forever." "How much money?" asked Buck Henley, the man who had initially questioned Boaz's identity. Torres named a figure that drew gasps from the crowd. It was more money than most of them would see in a lifetime, enough to set up Addie and Ada for life. "But it's not about the money," Ada said quietly, her young voice carrying clearly in the silent church. "It's about what Mama would have wanted." "What do you think she would have wanted?" Reverend Bell asked gently. Ada looked at her sister, and they shared one of those silent communications that twins seem to possess. "She'd want the land to be safe," Addie said finally. "She'd want it to be a place where families could go and be together, where children could play and learn about nature. She'd want it to help people," Ada added, "not make them fight and hurt each other." The wisdom in their words humbled every adult in the room. These 2 children, who had been through more trauma in the past month than many people faced in a lifetime, had found their way to the heart of the matter with the clear moral vision that only the innocent possess. "Then it's settled," Boaz said, his voice filled with pride in his daughters. "We'll sell the land to the territorial government with the condition that it be turned into a place where families can come to enjoy the wilderness." "And the money?" Torres asked. Boaz looked around the church at the faces of people who had risked everything to save his children. Part of it will go to building a proper school here in Wetstone Hollow, one that can serve all the children in the area. Part of it will help establish a medical clinic so people don't have to travel 50 miles when they're sick. And the rest? Mrs. Patterson prompted. The rest will help us build a house on the edge of town, Boaz replied, looking down at his daughters with infinite love. A house with a big garden where 2 little girls can grow up surrounded by people who care about them. The cheer that went up from the assembled townspeople shook the rafters of the old church. In the space of a few hours, they had faced down armed criminals, rescued 2 children, and found a solution that honored both Ruth's memory and her daughter's future. But as the celebration continued around them, Boaz noticed Deputy Marshal Torres speaking quietly with Sergeant Mathers near the door. Their expressions were grave, and he suspected their troubles weren't entirely over. "Marshal," he approached them as the crowd began to disperse. "Is there something else?" Torres nodded grimly. "Morrison died on the way to jail, but before he passed he said something that concerns me." "What?" He said, "Branford has men already in place waiting for orders. The attack today was just the first move in a larger game." The words sent a chill through Boaz. Even with the land sale resolved, his daughters might still be in danger from men who didn't know when to quit. "How long before the sale goes through?" he asked. "A few weeks, maybe a month," Torres replied. "Until then, you'll need to be careful, all of you." As they walked out into the cool night air, Addie slipped her hand into Boaz's. "Papa Boaz, are the bad men going to come back?" He looked down at her trusting face, then at Ada walking quietly beside them. These were his daughters, his responsibility, his reason for living. Whatever came next, he would be ready for it. "I don't know, honey," he answered honestly, "but if they do, they'll find out that this town doesn't give up on its own." The walk back to their temporary lodgings at the boarding house was peaceful, but Boaz remained alert, his eyes scanning the shadows and his hand never far from his weapon. The events in Serpent Canyon had proven that nowhere was truly safe, but they had also proven something else, that he and his daughters weren't facing the future alone. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would meet it together. The dawn that followed their return from Serpent Canyon brought with it an unsettling quiet that seemed to settle over Whetstone Hollow like morning mist. Boaz stood at the window of their room in Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, watching the sun climb over the eastern hills, while his daughters slept peacefully in the bed behind him. The events of the previous day felt like a nightmare, but the tender bruises on his ribs and the lingering fear on his chest reminded him that it had been all too real. A soft knock at the door interrupted his vigil. He opened it to find Deputy Marshal Torres, his face grim and his clothes bearing the dust of hard travel. "We need to talk," Torres said quietly, glancing toward the sleeping girls. "Somewhere private." They made their way downstairs to Mrs. Henderson's small parlor, where the elderly boarding house owner was already bustling about preparing breakfast for her guests. She took one look at their serious faces and tactfully withdrew to the kitchen, leaving them alone. "Morrison wasn't lying about Branford having men in place," Torres began without preamble. "We found their camp about 10 miles east of town. They cleared out fast, but they left behind enough to tell us we're dealing with something bigger than we thought." Boaz felt his stomach tighten. How much bigger? At least a dozen men, all armed and equipped for a long campaign, and they had surveying equipment, railroad maps, legal documents. Torres pulled a piece of paper from his coat pocket, including this. The document was a formal notice of eminent domain proceedings, stamped with official-looking seals and signatures. According to the paper, the territorial government had already approved the seizure of the Ellis land for railroad development. "This is impossible," Boaz said, studying the document. "You said the government was willing to buy the land for preservation." "That's what I was told by my superiors," Torres replied grimly. "But it seems there are people with more influence than mine working on this situation." "What does this mean?" "It means that even if you sell the land to the territorial government, These people might have legal grounds to take it anyway. The railroad lobby has friends in very high places. The implications hit Boaz like a physical blow. Even doing the right thing, even trying to resolve the situation peacefully, might not be enough to protect his daughters from men who saw them as obstacles to profit. "There's more," Torres continued. "I sent a telegram to the territorial capital yesterday asking about this Branford character. The response I got back was, 'Interesting.'" He pulled out a telegram and handed it to Boaz. The message was brief but chilling. "Investigation of Branford suspended by order of governor's office. Cease all inquiries immediately. Someone with real power wants this land." Boaz said the words, tasting bitter in his mouth. "And they're willing to use whatever means necessary to get it." Torres agreed. "Which brings me to why I'm here so early. I got word late last night that a federal judge is traveling through the territory. He'll be here this afternoon." "What kind of judge?" "The kind who can't be bought or intimidated. Judge Samuel Morrison, no relation to the dead gunfighter. He's got a reputation for being incorruptible, and he has jurisdiction over territorial land disputes." A spark of hope flickered in Boaz's chest. "You think he can help?" "I think he's our only chance of settling this legally before more blood gets spilled. But we'll need to move fast. If Branford's people find out about the judge's visit, they might try to stop him from reaching town." Footsteps on the stairs interrupted their conversation. Addie and Ada appeared in the doorway, their hair tousled with sleep, but their eyes alert and curious. "Papa Boaz," Addie said, rubbing her eyes, "why are you talking so serious with the marshal?" Before he could answer, Ada stepped forward and looked directly at Torres. "Are the bad men coming back?" The directness of her question caught Torres off guard. He glanced at Boaz, then knelt down to Ada's level, speaking to her with the same honesty he would give an adult. "We're trying to make sure they can't hurt you anymore, Ada, but it might take a little more time." "How much time?" she pressed, and Boaz marveled again at his daughter's ability to cut straight to the heart of any matter. "Hopefully just a few more days," Torres replied. "There's a judge coming to town who can help us make everything legal and final." Addie brightened at this news. "Mama always said judges were the ones who made sure the rules were fair for everyone." "Your mama was right," Torres agreed, standing up. "But until this judge can help us, you girls need to stay close to town, close to people who can protect you." The morning passed with an undercurrent of tension that even the normal rhythms of small-town life couldn't quite dispel. Boaz found himself constantly scanning faces, noting which strangers lingered too long at storefront windows, watching for any sign that Branford's men had infiltrated the town. Mrs. Patterson insisted on keeping the girls busy at the general store, teaching them to help with inventory and letting them play with the bolts of colorful fabric. But even her cheerful chatter couldn't completely mask the worry in her eyes. "Mr. McCrae," she said quietly when the girls were occupied in the back room, "I've been thinking about what happened yesterday. Those men knew exactly where to find your cabin, knew when you'd be asleep, knew how to get in without waking you." The implication of her words sent a chill through him. "You think someone in town is helping them?" "I don't want to think it," she replied, her voice heavy with reluctance. "But how else could they have known so much?" Before Boaz could respond, the door chimes announced a new customer. A well-dressed man in his 50s entered, wearing an expensive suit and carrying himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He surveyed the store with calculating eyes before approaching the counter. "Good morning," he said smoothly. "I'm looking for Mr. Boaz McCrae. I understand he's been staying in town." Mrs. Patterson's expression immediately became guarded. "And you are James Whitfield, attorney at law. I represent certain business interests that may be able to help resolve Mr. McCrae's current difficulties." Boaz stepped forward, every instinct warning him to be cautious. "I'm McCrae. What kind of help are you offering?" Whitfield smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. the kind that could make all your problems disappear overnight. My clients are prepared to make a very generous offer for your daughter's land, much more generous than the territorial government could ever match. We're not interested in selling to your clients, Boaz replied firmly. Perhaps you should hear the terms before you refuse, Whitfield pressed. We're talking about enough money to set your family up for life. Your daughters could have the finest education, the best of everything. At what cost? Whitfield's smile faltered slightly. I'm not sure I understand. What happens to the people who've been killed over this land? What happens to the men who kidnapped my children? Do they just disappear from the story when your clients get what they want? Mr. McCrae, I think you're misunderstanding the situation. My clients are legitimate businessmen, trying to bring progress and prosperity to this region. If certain unfortunate incidents have occurred, I assure you they were not sanctioned by my clients. And if I refuse your generous offer, then I'm afraid the legal proceedings will have to take their course. The eminent domain papers have already been filed. Your daughters will lose the land anyway, and you'll receive only minimal compensation. The threat was delivered with polished courtesy, but it was unmistakably a threat nonetheless. Boaz felt his temper rising, but before he could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. Eminent domain proceedings require proper judicial review, Mr. Whitfield. Everyone turned to see a dignified man in his 60s standing in the doorway wearing the black robes of a federal judge. His presence seemed to fill the small store with an aura of unshakable authority. Judge Morrison, Deputy Marshal Torres said, appearing behind the judge, "You made good time. When I heard about attempted child kidnapping and fraudulent land seizures, I decided speed was more important than comfort." The judge replied, his eyes never leaving Whitfield's increasingly pale face. "Your Honor," Whitfield began, his smooth confidence evaporating, "I wasn't aware you were in the territory." "I'm sure you weren't," Judge Morrison replied dryly. "Mr. Whitfield, isn't it? I believe I've seen your name on several cases that have come before my court. Cases involving questionable business practices and dubious legal maneuvers." "I resent the implication. I'm not implying anything." The judge cut him off. "I'm stating facts. And the fact is, any eminent domain proceedings in this territory require my approval, which I can assure you will not be forthcoming for this particular piece of land." Whitfield's mask of civility finally slipped entirely. "You don't understand the forces you're interfering with, Judge. There are people involved in this who have influence beyond your jurisdiction." "Are you threatening a federal judge, Mr. Whitfield?" The question hung in the air like a sword. Whitfield seemed to realize he had gone too far, his face flushing red as he struggled to backtrack. "Of course not, Your Honor. I was simply pointing out the complexity of the situation." "The situation seems quite simple to me," Judge Morrison replied calmly. "A family owns land that various parties want to acquire through illegal means. My job is to ensure that the law is followed and justice is served." He turned to Boaz, his stern expression softening slightly. "Mr. McCrae, I understand you and your daughters have been through a terrible ordeal. I'd like to hear your side of the story if you're willing." For the next hour, sitting in the back room of the general store while Addie and Ada played quietly nearby, Boaz told Judge Morrison everything that had happened since that stormy night when the twins had knocked on his cabin door. The judge listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small leather book. When Boaz finished, Judge Morrison sat in thoughtful silence for several minutes before speaking. "Mr. McCrae, in 30 years on the bench, I've seen many cases of powerful interests trying to steamroll over ordinary citizens, but I've rarely seen anything as brazen as this attempted land grab." "What can be done about it?" Boaz asked. "Several things," the judge replied. "First, I'm issuing an immediate injunction against any eminent domain proceedings involving the Ellis land. Second, I'm ordering a federal investigation into this Branford character and his business practices. Third, I'm authorizing Deputy Marshal Torres to arrest anyone who continues to threaten this family. Will that be enough to stop them? Judge Morrison's expression grew grim. Legal remedies are only as strong as the people willing to enforce them. And if what you've told me is true, we're dealing with people who have already shown a willingness to operate outside the law. As if summoned by his words, the sound of gunfire erupted from the main street. Everyone in the store froze, listening to the sharp crack of rifles and the shouts of angry men. "Stay with the girls," Boaz ordered Mrs. Patterson as he grabbed his rifle from behind the counter. "Papa Boaz, no!" Addie cried, running to him with tears in her eyes. "Don't go out there." He knelt down and pulled both girls into a fierce hug. "I have to, honey. I have to help protect the town." "But what if the bad men hurt you?" Ada whispered, her small hands clinging to his shirt. "They won't," he promised, though he had no way of knowing if that was true. "And if something does happen to me, Judge Morrison and Deputy Torres and all the good people in this town will take care of you." The gunfire was getting closer, and through the window they could see people running for cover. Whatever was happening outside was serious and immediate. "Mr. McCrae," Judge Morrison said firmly, "as a federal judge, I'm ordering you to stay here and protect these children. Let the law handle this." "With respect, Your Honor, the law needs all the help it can get right now." Before the judge could argue further, Deputy Marshal Torres burst through the door, his face grim and his weapon drawn. "They're attacking the jail," he announced. "At least 8 men trying to break out that surviving kidnapper we caught yesterday." "Why would they want him back?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "Because dead men can't testify," Judge Morrison replied grimly. "If they free him, they can make sure he disappears permanently." The sound of breaking glass came from the front of the store as a bullet shattered one of the windows. Everyone dropped to the floor as more shots followed the reports coming from multiple directions. "They're surrounding the building," Torres observed, crawling to peer carefully out the broken window. "This isn't just about the prisoner, they're after the judge." "What do you mean?" Boaz demanded. "Think about it," Torres explained. "Judge Morrison is the only one with the authority to stop their legal maneuvering. If something happens to him, the eminent domain proceedings go forward," Judge Morrison finished grimly. "Very clever. Make it look like random violence while achieving their larger objective." Another volley of gunfire erupted outside, this time accompanied by the sound of horses galloping past the store. Through the shattered window, they could see armed men taking positions behind wagons and buildings, clearly preparing for a prolonged siege. "How many people do we have who can fight?" Boaz asked Torres. "Maybe a dozen men in town who know how to handle weapons, but they're spread out trying to protect their own families." "What about Sergeant Mathers? He's at the jail with the sheriff trying to hold off the main assault." Judge Morrison struggled to his feet, dusting off his black robes with dignity despite the circumstances. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your desire to protect me, but I won't have innocent people die for my sake. If these men want to settle this with violence, so be it." "Your Honor, you can't," Torres began. "I can and I will," the judge interrupted. "I've been threatened by better men than these railroad lackeys, and I'm still here." "Judge Morrison," came a voice from outside, amplified by someone shouting through cupped hands. "We know you're in there. Come out peaceful-like and nobody else has to get hurt." "Like hell," Judge Morrison muttered, then called back in a voice that carried the full authority of his position. "This is Federal Judge Samuel Morrison. You men are interfering with a federal officer in the performance of his duties. Surrender immediately." The response was a hail of bullets that sent everyone diving for cover again. When the shooting stopped, they could hear laughter from outside. "Doesn't sound like they're impressed by federal authority," Whitfield observed from his position, cowering behind a barrel of flour. "Mr. Whitfield," Judge Morrison said coldly, "I suggest you pray that my authority is respected, because if something happens to me, the territorial governor will send federal troops to investigate. That level of attention won't be good for your clients." Before Whitfield could respond, a new sound reached them from outside. The rhythmic beating of a drum accompanied by voices raised in what sounded like a war chant. "What in the hell?" Torres muttered, risking a glance out the window. What he saw made his eyes widen in amazement. Coming down the main street was a group of Crow warriors on horseback, their faces painted for battle and their weapons gleaming in the afternoon sun. At their head rode Jonah Two Rivers, no longer dressed in the simple clothes of a town scout, but in the full regalia of a tribal warrior. "Jonah," Boaz called out in confusion. "The young man has more friends than we knew." Judge Morrison observed with satisfaction. The arrival of the Crow warriors changed the dynamics of the battle immediately. The attackers, who had been confident in their superiority of numbers and firepower, suddenly found themselves facing opponents who knew the art of war in ways they had never imagined. The warriors moved like ghosts, using every piece of cover, every shadow, every angle of approach to systematically eliminate the attackers' positions. Their war cries echoed off the buildings, carrying with them the weight of generations of resistance to those who would steal what belonged to others. "Papa Boaz," Ada whispered, tugging at his sleeve. "Why are they helping us?" "Because Jonah is our friend," he replied, watching through the window as the tide of battle turned. "And because they understand what it means to have your land stolen by people who think they have the right to take whatever they want." The gunfight that followed was brief, but intense. The attackers, caught between the advancing warriors and the defenders in the town, found their positions becoming untenable. One by one, they began to retreat, some on foot, others managing to reach their horses, but not all of them escaped. When the shooting finally stopped and the dust settled, 3 bodies lay in the street, and several wounded men sat with their hands raised in surrender. Jonah Two Rivers appeared at the door of the general store, his paint-streaked face breaking into a grin when he saw that everyone was safe. "Thought you might need some help," he said casually, as if arriving with a war party was the most natural thing in the world. "How did you know?" Torres asked. "Smoke signals," Jonah replied simply. "Word travels fast when the people want it to. We heard there was trouble in town and that you were facing more enemies than you could handle alone." Judge Morrison stepped forward, extending his hand to the young warrior. "On behalf of the federal government, I thank you and your people for your assistance." "We didn't do it for the federal government," Jonah replied, shaking the offered hand. "We did it for these children, and for the idea that nobody should have their homes stolen from them." As order was restored to the town and the wounded attackers were taken into custody, a larger picture began to emerge. Under interrogation, several of the captured men revealed details about Branford's operation that painted a picture of corruption reaching all the way to the territorial capital. "This is bigger than just one piece of land," Judge Morrison told the assembled townspeople that evening as they gathered in the church. "This is about a systematic effort to steal land from families throughout the territory, using a combination of legal manipulation and outright violence." "What happens now?" Pete Garrison asked. "Now we send word to Washington," the judge replied. "This situation requires federal intervention on a scale that goes far beyond my individual authority." "How long will that take?" Mrs. Patterson wanted to know. "Weeks, possibly months," Judge Morrison admitted. "But in the meantime, I'm establishing a federal protection order for this family and this town. Anyone who threatens them will be dealing with the full force of federal law." As the meeting broke up and people began to head home, Boaz found himself walking with Judge Morrison toward the boarding house. "Judge," he said quietly, "what are the chances that this really ends the threat to my daughters?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Mr. McCrae, in my experience, men like Branford don't give up easily. They have too much invested, too much to lose, but what happened here today sends a message that will be heard all the way back to wherever they're making their plans." "What kind of message?" "That this town, this family, these children are not alone. That there are people willing to stand with them, to fight for them, to risk everything to protect what's right." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the peaceful sounds of evening settling over Whetstone Hollow. Children could be heard playing in nearby yards, and the smell of cooking dinners drifted from open windows. "Judge Morrison," Addie's voice called from the boarding house porch, where she and Ada had been waiting for their father's return. "Are the bad men all gone now?" "For now, child," the judge replied gently, "but your papa and all the good people in this town are going to make sure you stay safe." "Will you stay and help protect us?" Ada asked with the directness that seemed to be her trademark. Judge Morrison smiled, the stern lines of his face softening. "I'll stay as long as I can, Ada, but even when I have to leave, there will be other people watching over you." As they reached the boarding house, Mrs. Henderson appeared on the porch with a worried expression. "Mr. McCrae," she said, "there's been a man here asking questions about you and the girls. Said he was a relative from back east, but something about him didn't sit right with me." "What kind of questions?" Torres asked, appearing from the shadows where he had been keeping watch. "Wanted to know what rooms you were staying in, what your routines were when you usually went to bed. I told him I didn't discuss my guests' business with strangers." "Good woman," Judge Morrison approved. "What did this man look like?" "Middle-aged, well-dressed, but with cold eyes, and he had a scar on his left hand, like maybe from a knife fight." Boaz felt his blood chill. The description matched one of the men who had been at Serpent Canyon, one who had escaped during the confusion of the gunfight. "He's still in town," Torres said grimly, "probably waiting for another chance." "Then we don't give him one," Judge Morrison declared. "Mr. McCrae, I'm ordering you and your daughters into protective custody. You'll stay at the jail tonight where we can be sure of your safety." "The jail?" Addie asked with wide eyes. "Are we in trouble?" "No, honey," Boaz explained, lifting her into his arms. "The judge just wants to make sure we're safe while the bad men are still around." "Will there be other people there to protect us?" Ada wanted to know. Sergeant Mathers, Deputy Torres Jonah, 2 Rivers, and several of the Crow warriors. Judge Morrison listed. "I think that should be sufficient." As they gathered their few belongings and prepared to move to the more secure location, Boaz couldn't help but reflect on how much his life had changed since that stormy night when 2 small girls had knocked on his cabin door. He had gone from being a solitary hermit to being part of a community, from having nothing to lose to having everything that mattered in the world. The thought of men still hunting his daughters filled him with a cold rage that he struggled to contain, but it also filled him with determination. These children had already lost their mother. They would not lose their father, and they would not lose their chance at the peaceful, happy life that Ruth had dreamed of for them. "Papa Boaz," Ada said quietly as they walked toward the jail through the lamplit streets. "When all the bad men are gone, can we really build a house with a garden?" "Yes, sweetheart," he promised. "We'll build the most beautiful house you've ever seen, with the biggest garden in all of Montana. And will all our friends be able to visit us there?" "Every single one of them," he assured her. "Mrs. Patterson and Sergeant Mathers and Jonah and Reverend Bell and everyone who helped keep us safe." As they reached the jail, where warm light spilled from the windows and the sound of friendly voices could be heard, inside Boaz felt a sense of peace settle over him, despite the dangers that still lurked in the darkness. His daughters were safe, surrounded by people who cared about them, protected by laws and friendships that no amount of money could corrupt. The storm that had brought Addie and Ada to his door had also brought him back into the world of human connection and community. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were home. The morning that would change everything dawned crisp and clear, with autumn painting the mountains in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. 6 months had passed since the gunfight that had finally broken Branford's stranglehold on Whetstone Hollow, and the federal investigation had rooted out corruption that reached all the way to Washington. The town had settled into a peaceful rhythm that seemed almost dreamlike after the violence and fear that had preceded it. Boaz stood on the porch of the half-finished house that was rising on the edge of town, watching as Addie and Ada chased fireflies in the meadow that would soon become their garden. The sound of their laughter carried on the evening breeze, mixing with the distant sounds of hammering, as Pete Garrison and his sons worked by lamplight to finish the roof before the first snows came. "Papa Boaz," Addie called out, running toward him with a mason jar full of blinking lights. "Look how many we caught." "Beautiful," he said, kneeling down to admire their collection. "But you know what we have to do with them, don't you?" "Set them free," Ada said solemnly, appearing beside her sister with her own jar, "so they can find their way home." It had become their evening ritual, catching fireflies only to release them again, watching them dance away into the darkness like tiny stars returning to the sky. Ruth would have loved this. Boaz thought the simple joy of children playing safely in their own yard while their father watched over them. "Mr. McCrae," came a voice from behind him. He turned to see Reverend Bell approaching, his face beaming with the kind of satisfaction that came from watching a long-cherished dream finally come to fruition. "Reverend," Boaz acknowledged, standing and extending his hand, "come to check on our progress." "Among other things," Bell replied, accepting the handshake warmly. "The church ladies wanted me to tell you that the quilting circle has finished the bedspreads for the girls' rooms. Mrs. Patterson is practically beside herself with excitement about the housewarming." "She's been more excited about this house than we have," Boaz observed with amusement. "I think she's already planned 3 different dinner parties for when we move in." "She's not the only one," Bell said with a chuckle. "Half the town has been asking when they can come see the finished house. You've become quite the local celebrities." As if summoned by their conversation, a small parade of visitors began arriving for what had become their regular evening gathering. Sergeant Mathers rode up on his black horse, followed by Martha Tooley in her medical wagon, and finally Jonah Two Rivers leading a group of Crow elders who had become regular participants in the community discussions that shaped the town's future. "Evening, Boaz," Mathers called out as he dismounted. "How's the construction coming along?" "Faster than I ever imagined," Boaz replied honestly. "When Judge Morrison arranged for those federal work crews to help with the school and medical clinic, I never expected them to volunteer their time for our house, too." "Word gets around," Martha Tooley said as she climbed down from her wagon. "When federal workers hear about a family that stood up to railroad corruption and won, they tend to want to lend a hand." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar wagon bearing Deputy Marshal Torres and an unexpected passenger, a dignified, elderly black woman whose presence immediately commanded attention and respect. "Mrs. Ellis," Torres said as he helped the woman down from the wagon, "I'd like you to meet Boaz McCrae and his daughters." Boaz felt his heart stop. This was Ruth's mother, the grandmother that Addie and Ada had never met, but had heard stories about all their lives. The resemblance was unmistakable, the same intelligent eyes, the same proud bearing, the same gentle strength that had characterized her daughter. "Grandmama Ruth?" Addie exclaimed, recognizing her instantly from her mother's descriptions. Both girls ran to the elderly woman, who enfolded them in her arms with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "My precious babies," she whispered, holding them close. "You look just like your mama did when she was your age." "Mama told us you lived far away," Ada said, looking up at her grandmother with wonder. "How did you find us?" "Deputy Torres sent word when everything got settled with the bad men," Mrs. Ellis explained, her voice thick with emotion. "I've been traveling for 2 weeks to get here, and every mile was worth it to see my granddaughters safe and happy." She turned to Boaz, studying his face with the penetrating gaze of a woman who had learned to read character through decades of hard experience. "So you're the man my Ruth never stopped loving," she said quietly. Mrs. Ellis, Boaz began, but she held up a hand to stop him. Don't you go apologizing for the past, she said firmly. Ruth told me in her letters about the choices you both made when you were young and scared. What matters is that you came when these babies needed you, and you've given them a family again. I should have come sooner, he said, the old guilt still heavy in his voice. Maybe so, Mrs. Ellis acknowledged. But my Ruth always said that God's timing isn't the same as ours. These girls needed to lose their mama before they could find their papa, needed to face danger before they could find safety, needed to feel alone before they could discover how many people cared about them. As the evening progressed and the usual gathering of friends and neighbors settled into comfortable conversation, Mrs. Ellis shared stories about Ruth's childhood that brought her daughter to life in ways that amazed and delighted the twins. Your mama was the most stubborn child I ever raised, she told them as they sat around the fire that Pete Garrison had built in the stone fireplace. When she was about your age, she decided she was going to teach herself to read by studying the Bible. Took her most of a year, but she did it, and after that, there was no stopping her. She taught us to read too, Addie said proudly. We can read almost anything now. And we're going to go to the new school when it's finished, Ada added. Papa Boaz says it's going to be the finest school in all of Montana. It will be, Reverend Bell confirmed. The federal funding that came through after the corruption investigation has allowed us to hire real teachers, buy proper books, even set up a library. Speaking of the school, Sergeant Mathers interjected, we got word today that the territorial government has officially designated the Ellis land as a protected wilderness area. It's going to be preserved in perpetuity, just like the girls wanted. A cheer went up from the gathered friends, and Boaz felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he'd been carrying for months. The land that had caused so much bloodshed and fear was finally officially safe from development forever. What about the money from the sale? Mrs. Patterson asked, ever practical in her concerns. Half of it went to fund the school and medical clinic, just as we planned. Judge Morrison announced, appearing in the doorway with the satisfied expression of a man who had just concluded important business. The other half has been placed in trust for Addie and Ada's education and future. Judge Morrison! The girls exclaimed in unison, running to greet the man who had become almost like a grandfather to them. Hello, my dear ones, he said warmly, lifting them both for hugs. I have some very good news for all of you. Better news than Grandmama Ruth coming to visit? Addie asked skeptically. Well, perhaps not better, the judge conceded with a smile, but important nonetheless. The federal investigation is officially complete, and every last member of Branford's organization has been arrested and convicted. You'll never have to worry about those men again. The relief that washed over the gathered crowd was palpable. For months, even as life had returned to normal, there had been an underlying tension, a fear that somewhere out there, other enemies might be plotting revenge. It's really over, Boaz asked, hardly daring to believe it. Completely over, Judge Morrison confirmed. Branford himself will spend the rest of his life in federal prison, and his organization has been dismantled entirely. The railroad companies have been forced to find legitimate routes for their expansion, and new laws have been passed to prevent this kind of corruption in the future. As the celebration continued around them, Mrs. Ellis drew Boaz aside for a private conversation. They walked to the edge of the meadow where the lights of Wetstone Hollow twinkled below them like earthbound stars. My Ruth chose well, she said quietly, watching Addie and Ada play with the other children by the firelight. Those girls have found their place in the world, and you found yours too. I still miss her, Boaz admitted. Every day I wish she could see what her daughters have become, could see the life we're building here. Oh, she sees, Mrs. Ellis said with quiet conviction. Every laugh from those babies, every night they go to sleep safe and loved, every friend who rallies to protect them. Ruth sees all of it, and she's proud of the man you've become. I want to do right by them. Boaz said, his voice rough with emotion. I want to be the father they deserve. You already are, Mrs. Ellis replied firmly. Look around you, son. Look at this community. You've helped build these friendships. You forged this home you're creating. Ruth dreamed of this for her daughters, and you've made it real. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching. A small group of riders emerged from the darkness, but instead of the tension that such arrivals had once brought, these visitors were greeted with warmth and welcome. Mayor Caldwell, Reverend Bell called out as Henry Caldwell dismounted, now wearing the badge of his new office. What brings you out so late? Official business, Caldwell replied with a grin. The territorial governor has sent word about the railroad compensation funds. Turns out that when the federal investigation exposed all that corruption, they found a lot of money that had been stolen from communities throughout the territory. What does that mean for us? Torres asked. It means that Wetstone Hollow is getting a substantial settlement, enough to build not just the school and clinic we planned, but also a proper town hall, a fire station, and funding for a town constable. And, Caldwell continued, his grin growing wider. The governor has asked me to extend a formal invitation to Mr. McCrae to serve as that constable if he's interested. The suggestion caught Boaz completely off guard. Me, but I'm not a lawman. You stood up to armed criminals to protect children, Judge Morrison pointed out. You've helped hold this community together through its darkest hours. That's exactly the kind of experience we need in a constable. Think about it, Sergeant Mathers added. You know every trail and hiding place in these mountains. You've proven you can handle yourself in a fight. And most importantly, people trust you. I don't know anything about being a lawman, Boaz protested. You know everything about being a good man, Martha Tooley observed. The rest can be learned. As the discussion continued around him, Boaz found himself looking at his daughters who were listening to their grandmother tell stories about their mother's youth. The idea of taking on official responsibility for the community's safety was daunting, but it also felt like a natural extension of everything that had led him to this moment. Papa Boaz. Ada appeared at his side, tugging on his sleeve, with that serious expression she wore when something important was on her mind. Are you going to be a real sheriff? Constable, he corrected gently. And I haven't decided yet. What do you think I should do? Ada considered this with the gravity of a judge weighing evidence. I think Mama would want you to help keep people safe, she said finally, just like you kept us safe. And besides, Addie added, bouncing up to join the conversation, if you're the constable, then the bad men will know not to come to our town anymore. The simple wisdom of their words settled the matter in his mind. All right, he said, turning to Mayor Caldwell, I accept. The cheer that went up from the assembled crowd seemed to echo off the mountains themselves. As handshakes and congratulations flowed around him, Boaz felt a sense of completion that he'd never experienced before. The broken man who had hidden from the world for 20 years was gone, replaced by someone who belonged, someone who mattered, someone with a purpose beyond mere survival. When do I start? He asked Judge Morrison. Tomorrow, if you're willing, the judge replied. I'll swear you in myself before I head back to the territorial capital. And your first official duty, Mrs. Patterson announced with barely contained excitement, will be to help keep order at the Harvest Festival next week. Half the territory is planning to attend. What Harvest Festival? Boaz asked. The one we're throwing to celebrate the completion of the school, the medical clinic, and your new house, Reverend Bell explained. It's going to be the biggest celebration Whetstone Hollow has ever seen. As the evening wound down and their friends began to depart for their homes, Mrs. Ellis lingered with Boaz and the girls on the porch of their nearly finished house. I have something for you, she told the twins, reaching into her traveling bag. Something that belonged to your mama." She pulled out a small wooden music box, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. When she opened it, a gentle melody began to play. The same tune that Ruth used to hum when she was working in their tiny apartment above the general store. "Mama's music box," Addie exclaimed with delight. "She used to play it for us every night before bed. She wanted you to have it when you were old enough to take proper care of it," Mrs. Ellis explained. "I think that time has come." As the tinkling melody filled the evening air, Boaz felt Ruth's presence more strongly than he had since that first night when the twins had arrived at his cabin. She was here in this music, in her daughters' faces, in the community that had rallied to protect the family she had loved. "Grandmama Ruth," Ada said quietly, "will you stay with us for a long time?" "As long as you need me, baby girl," Mrs. Ellis replied, gathering both children into her arms. "I've come home to be with my family, and I'm not planning on leaving again." Later that night, after the girls had been tucked into their beds at the boarding house and Mrs. Ellis had settled into the room next door, Boaz walked alone through the quiet streets of Wetstone Hollow. As the newly appointed constable, he told himself he was simply making his first patrol, but in truth, he needed time to process the magnitude of the changes that had transformed his life. The town slept peacefully around him, its windows glowing with warm lamplight, and its streets empty except for the occasional cat prowling for mice. This was his town now, his responsibility, his home. The mountains that had once been his refuge still rose majestically around the valley, but they no longer represented escape from the world. Instead, they stood as guardians protecting the community that had become his world. When he reached the cemetery on the hill overlooking the town, he found himself standing before a simple headstone marked Ruth Ellis, beloved mother and friend. Someone had left fresh wildflowers at the base of the stone, probably Mrs. Patterson or one of the other church ladies who made sure Ruth's grave was never neglected. "We did it, Ruth," he said quietly, his words carried away by the mountain breeze. "Your girls are safe, they're happy, and they're going to have the life you dreamed of for them." He knelt and placed his hand on the smooth granite surface, feeling the cool stone beneath his weathered palm. "I know I can't undo the past, can't give you back the years I should have been here. But I promise you this, Addie and Ada will never doubt that they're loved, never doubt that they belong, never doubt that they have a father who would move mountains to keep them safe." A shooting star streaked across the sky above him, bright and brief and beautiful. Boaz chose to take it as a sign, Ruth's way of telling him that she heard his promise and approved of the man he had become. The walk back to the boarding house took him past the construction site where their new home was taking shape. In the moonlight, he could see the strong timber frame, the stone foundation, the beginnings of what would soon be a place where his daughters could grow up surrounded by love and security. Tomorrow would bring the oath-taking ceremony that would make him officially responsible for the law and order of Whetstone Hollow. Next week would bring the Harvest Festival that would celebrate not just the completion of their community projects, but the triumph of ordinary people over forces that had seemed insurmountable. But tonight, Boaz McCrae stood on the threshold of his new life and felt a peace that had eluded him for 20 years. He was no longer the broken hermit who had fled to the mountains to escape his failures. He was a father, a citizen, a protector of the innocent, a man who had found his way back to the human community he had thought was lost to him forever. The twins who had knocked on his door during that long-ago storm had brought him more than just the chance at fatherhood. They had brought him redemption purpose and the discovery that even the most damaged soul could find its way back to wholeness. As he climbed the steps to the boarding house where his family waited, Boaz whispered a final prayer of gratitude to whatever force had sent Addie and Ada to his door. The storm that had brought them together had given way to the clearest skies he had ever seen, and the future stretched before them bright with infinite possibility. In the room above, he could hear the faint tinkling of Ruth's music box as one of the girls wound it up for a final song before sleep. The melody drifted down to him like a benediction, a mother's lullaby blessing the new life her sacrifice had made possible. The mountain man's long journey home was complete.